aware of is that macroeconomics is a quantitative study, and therefore we have to have data. And there are lots of data dealing with inflation. And the most preferred measure of inflation is the core personal consumption expenditures deflator, which is the one that the Federal Reserve and most government agencies prefer. And of course, you see the definition, so I don't need to go over it. That is not to say that the CPI is not important. It is very important. And even though the PCE deflator at its core is the preferred measure, say, of the Fed, doesn't mean that they don't look at other price indexes. But as you know, they're very, very different. The CPI is based on a market basket that is considered representative of what an urban consumer would buy, where the PCE deflator covers everything in the 2/3 of the GDP that is personal consumption expenditures. And it's looking at changes in the prices of those goods and services that are in PCE. So it's really important, but the preferred way to look at these data, as I pointed out to you, is at the core, which means you take out the prices of food and energy, the movement of which is considered to be exogenous, doesn't really reflect what's going on underneath the economy in terms of, actual supply and demand conditions, for example. And it's quite volatile, so we take it out so we get a much smoother, clearer picture of what's going on endogenously in the economy. We know that inflation is related to money supply, but as I've pointed out to you, that relationship is long, it's variable, and it's highly uncertain. We know that money supply growth accommodates inflation and can be a cause, but it is not the cause, it is a cause of inflation. And we look at various models to help us look at where inflation may be going, and the commonality among those models, which we went into in detail in the last class. The commonality is something on one hand which gives you a sense of potential or actual spending power from which you get demand, and the other side being something which gives you a sense of where you're going to get supply from productivity growth, for example, or growth in the labor force. And you're looking at some balance between aggregate demand and aggregate supply through these various models. And of course, to the extent that demand or the potential for demand grows at a rate which is faster than aggregate supply, you're going to get inflation. As I said, it means your demand curve is moving to the right by more than your supply curve, so the price level goes up. We talked about the growth rates in the economy. This is just a simple way of saying MV equals PY, but if you take logarithms, you get the growth rates, and what that does is it converts it to a different form that just says growth in the money supply plus growth in velocity equals growth in the price index, or inflation, plus growth in real GDP. And of course, growth in inflation plus growth in real GDP is growth in nominal GDP. This is just a mathematical truism, almost a definition. But you should be aware of it. There was actually a question on this in your first exam. Money illusion. Money illusion comes about when people think they're actually richer just because they have more money. But a point I've made repeatedly is, if you have 2% more money or 2% more income, but the price level is up by 5%, you're not better off. You may feel like you are. Oh, wow, my paycheck is bigger than it was last month. Well, that's terrific. But if the price level is up since last month, maybe you're not better off. So we don't want to suffer money illusion. We know right now that one of the things that central banks are doing, which is, for the United States at least, I would dare say in terms of its scale and its scope is unprecedented, is the Federal Reserve, in effect, printing or creating bank reserves that become money supply. And in a way, they're helping to monetize the debt. The debt is growing bigger and bigger and bigger. It grew a whole lot, potentially starting when President Biden signed, the Relief Act, the American Relief Act. Where's the money coming from to pay for this? And in a way, it's happened because the Federal Reserve has created so many bank reserves that the money supply over the past year has grown at a 26% annual rate. There's all this money flying around out there that's depressed interest rates and made it easier for the Congress to pass legislation, or I should say for the Democrats to pass legislation and for the president to sign it. But a good portion of that comes with sort of a kind of a logic that says we can go deeper and deeper into debt as long as we can afford to pay off that debt. And in order to afford to pay off that debt, the interest rates have to stay low. Well, in the news today is a report that, well, what I just said to you is a partial story, because now apparently President Biden is proposing the largest tax increase in the US since 1973. So on the one hand, we're monetizing the debt and paying it off in effect by growing the money supply and keeping interest rates low. And now the president is turning around and saying, well, now I want to start to pay off the debt by raising taxes. Biggest tax increase proposal since 1993. Now, it's all very, very vague at this point. The president does not have a package that he has presented to the House of Representatives. But usually with things like this, where there's smoke, there's fire. So we're looking at tax increases coming down the road. And you're probably going to get them at the state level, and you're probably going to get them at the federal level, and you're going to see fees go up as well. Tuition, transit fares, bridge tolls have already gone up. Prices to, say, register a car, price for a driver's license, all these things are headed higher. And this is all now part and parcel of this notion that if you spend and spend and spend, you got to somehow pay for it. If low interest rates alone will not help you to pay off the debt by making the economy stronger, so more money goes into the coffers of the Treasury Department, if that's not enough, then you got to raise taxes. That's where we're headed.
Professor, can I ask a question?
Of course.
Where does the debt get paid to?
Well, it gets paid to those who lent money to the government. So how do you lend money to the government? You lend money to the government by buying U.S. Treasury securities, Treasury bills, notes, and bonds. So you're lending, let's say a typical Treasury security is $10,000. You're lending to the government $10,000 with a promise that they will pay you back your $10,000 when that security matures, plus whatever interest is paid on that security. So that's where it goes.
So this is
and
like
then the question is, well, who
domestic
owns
debt?
all of these securities? I'm sorry?
So it's domestic debt?
Not all of it, no. A lot of U.S. Treasury debt, bills, notes, and bonds are owned by foreign entities. Chinese being the biggest, and the countries in the European Central Bank own. OPEC countries, really all over the world, they're owned. They're owned privately by individuals and businesses and pension plans. They're owned by governments and central banks. So it's not all domestic debt. Now, the largest portion of the debt is owned by American entities, and it could be someone like you or me, or it could be a pension plan or insurance company or a bank or a financial, an asset management firm. It could be anybody. It could even, well, I won't go there. So yeah, it's all over the place. And so when they go into debt, they have to borrow. And in order to borrow, they have to have someone lending to them. And the way we lend to the US government is by buying Treasury securities. As I said, bills, which are from 31 days out to 1 year, notes, which are 2 years to 10 years in maturity, and bonds, which are greater than 10 years in maturity. That's it. So all those securities are out there, and then you're playing a game of supply and demand. If they keep increasing the supply of these securities, but the demand for them is not keeping up, then the price is going to fall, which means the interest rate is going to go up. And that's what we're looking at potentially if the Federal Reserve ever drops out, because the Federal Reserve is the single biggest buyer of Treasury securities. And if for whatever reason they decide they don't want to be so accommodative in terms of supplying liquidity to the markets, they will buy fewer of these securities. And then the question will be, well, if the Fed doesn't absorb these securities, who will? And that's an issue that hangs over the markets. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. Terrific question, though. Thank you for asking it.
Professor, can I ask one question too?
Of course, Brian.
Do we have I know we're not allowed to, like the government doesn't know who owns the debt, but do we have any idea, like who owns the most debt?
Do you mean which individual entity? In other words, does Merrill Lynch own it, or Goldman Sachs, or is that what you're asking
Yeah,
me?
whether it's a company or a country, who owns the most of the
Well,
debt?
we have the data by country, and that's readily available on the internet. I mean, you could just Google that. But in terms of, whether or not, Citibank or Chase or Goldman Sachs or, you know, you pick the company, how much they own, that's private information. But we do know, who owns these securities internationally. And so we can calculate what share of all Treasury securities are owned by foreign entities. Just Google it, and it'll come right up for you. Okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's not talk about this. Let's not talk about intermediation. This is pretty obvious. Let's just go right to the IS curve. Before we do this, because I've looked at over 130 answer sheets from the exam that you took between my two classes, there is something that was readily apparent, and that is you had a lot of trouble as a group with the solo growth model questions, and with growth in particular. I raise that point to you because it is the only time during the entire semester where I said to you, you must, absolutely must, play with the equations by yourself. You need to sit down, you need to manipulate them, you need to do the algebra, you need to get them moving in the left part of your brain by manipulating the equations in your own right. It's not something we can do in a remote class. And even if we had a blackboard, we couldn't do that. It's sometimes you have to study by yourself. And if you don't, you're going to get in trouble. And indeed, there was a lot of trouble with that because you did not put in the sweat equity. I mention that to you because in working with the IS curve, those of you who have, and I hope it's all of you, who have looked at the PowerPoint presentation know there's a lot of equations in here. And if you don't manipulate the equations, they will go right past you. We don't have time to move all of the different variables around one after the other as we might if we had a blackboard. And even if we did, I would still say the same thing. You have to do it yourself. So I'm glad I'm on the record. I'm glad I'm being recorded. You really, really have to start to look at these equations and manipulate them. And when you do, you will get all of the aha moments. This is just a matter of moving around variables. There's no high-level mathematics here. There's no calculus. There's no, analytic geometry, nothing like that. It's just a matter of simple 7th grade algebra for you. And I hope you will do that. Okay? So that having been said, the IS curve. Now, I studied the IS curve, back when I was a student in this course, and you will see in a minute a page that came from my notebook from what is now Economics 201, when I was a student at Queens College, because actually theory is theory, it doesn't change. So you will see the way my professor presented it, which I think is absolutely brilliant. He did, not my creation, it was Professor Eilbat's. That having been said, let's talk about what we're trying to look at here. You see an I and you see an S. And when you see an I and you see an S, you're seeing investment and you're seeing savings. And we know that ex post investment has to equal savings in a two-sector model, meaning like we did with the growth model, when you only have consumption and investment. No government sector, no foreign sector, that's it. IS. And in the end, the entire class that we will have today effectively boils down to just 2 or 3 major principles that you will pull out of it that you will see, I think, in the next slide. Mastery of this slide and understanding why it is what it is really the heart of all you need to know. So what it's getting at is a relationship between investment and interest rates on the one hand, and then a relationship between savings and income on the other hand. Now notice where I just went, investment and interest rates. The variable here is interest rates. Effectively, you're saying investment is a function of interest rates. Well, you would expect that. If interest rates go lower, you would expect there to be more borrowing, and you borrow in order to buy expensive things like capital goods. That makes sense. Next, there's a relationship between saving and income. Well, that's not terribly profound. Who saves more? One of us or Bill Gates or, Bezos. Bezos made $35 billion during the month of January. 35 billion is what he made, which was amazing because his divorce settled at 38 million. He gave his ex-wife 38 billion and made back 35 of it in 1 month. But who's going to save more, Bezos or us? Of course he's going to save more than we do. I mean, how many bellies do we think he has? I mean, how much is he going to eat? How much is he going to travel? How much clothing do you think the guy's going to buy? So we know that there's going to be a relationship between saving and income. We also know, well, let me just leave it at that. And that's really where we go with an IS curve. So let's see how this plays out. And then let's see how the equations work so that I give you the foundations for understanding your textbook chapter, but also the kinds of things you would see in graduate school if you go on in economics. So there's a lot of things that are written here, and let's see if we can work through them. As I've said to you on many, many occasions, I will point out to you individual slides and say, you must understand this slide. And I use the word understand because understanding is a level that's higher than knowing the facts. Knowing the facts is one thing, understanding them is something else, because if you can understand them, you could explain them to somebody else. So for our purposes, we're going to assume that we have only two sectors, a household sector and a business sector, meaning consumption and investment. Next, so many people, just like they misstate what Say's law is and so many other things that are misstated in economics, so many things in economics are misstated in terms of what's meant by an equilibrium. Equilibrium is a peculiar kind of a condition. We know we are in equilibrium when, if the economy ever moves away from those conditions, there will be forces in the economy that will pull you right back to it. Think about that for a minute. If you think of a demand curve and a supply curve, where they intersect is the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity. So suppose the price is higher than the equilibrium price. We have moved away from the equilibrium price. What's going to happen is the quantity demanded is going to be less than the quantity supplied. The economy will respond to that. Businesses that have less quantity demanded than they are willing and able to put on the market for sale are going to lower their price. They're going to produce less. The price will fall again back toward equilibrium. So if you ever move away from an equilibrium point, economic forces will be put into effect to draw you toward that. Second principle that we need to gather. Okay? So for there to be a general equilibrium in the economy, planned savings have to equal planned investment. So think of it this way. Income can only be spent or saved or not spent. What we spend, we call consumption. What we don't spend, we call savings. So income equals consumption plus savings. So all you can do with your disposable income is spend it or not spend it. And the part you don't spend, we call savings. Businesses, we're now in the other sector of our economy. Remember, we're a two-sector model. Businesses produce goods and services. Outputs that are used up means that they're consumed. Output that's not used up is inventory, which is a form of investment. So if output equals C plus S and output equals C plus I, then S has to equal I. Again, very simple. Simplistically, we would expect investment to be negatively correlated with the level of interest rates. That is generally true. It is not always true, but it is generally true. And that's because investment is financed mainly through borrowing. You know, if businesses are going to invest, let's say they're going to invest in another company and engage in a buyout of a company. Maybe you're going to buy out your competitor. You're not going to put up cash for that. You're going to borrow money to do that. Okay. In addition, the higher the interest rate, the higher the expected discounted rate of return over time of the investment that you need to justify doing it. Now, we've talked about discounted rates of return. Remember, we talked about what happens when we look at the earnings of an individual over time. And the question on your exam came up about, you know, what happens with the guy who fell out of the tree that he was cutting down limbs, and now his attorney is suing for lost lifetime earnings. You got to look at the discounted value of that, and you discount using the interest rate. Aggregate savings tend to increase with incomes. My point being, Jeff Bezos saves more than we do. As incomes rise, all sectors of the economy tend to save more. That's what we are. Which takes us to the red letters. I hope in the 5 or 6 bullet points that we've done so far that there's nothing that you didn't understand, because if there is, please say so and we'll go over it. So here's the key to an IS curve. Given all the statements above, for each level of interest rates, for each level of interest rates, think of the interest rates as being the vertical axis, okay? There's a level of income that will make the level of aggregate savings equal to the level of aggregate investment. Remember, it's an IS curve, and at every point along an IS curve, investment equals savings. But at every point along an IS curve, you have a different interest rate in combination with a different income level. Okay, so for each level of interest rates, there's a level of income that will make aggregate savings equal to aggregate investment. We would expect that the level of income that would equate total savings with total investment would be higher the lower the interest rate. Well, I'll just stop there because this is explained in the final 3 lines here. So here is what you want to be pondering. Higher interest rates are associated with less borrowing by businesses to make investments. That should be clear. It makes the cost of investment higher, and the discounted rate of return that you get becomes lower. Because your expense is higher due to interest costs. So if interest rates go up and investment goes down, national income falls. So with higher interest rates in turn, the level of national income needed to equate aggregate savings with aggregate investment is lower. And for that reason, an IS curve slopes downward. So what does that say? As interest rates go up, you're going to get less investment. And if you're going to get less investment, then in order to equate investment and savings, you need less savings, which means you need a lower national income. And here's how it's demonstrated. This, by the way, is directly out of my notebook when I was an undergraduate. We'll come back to this. So, the interest rate goes up, investment falls, output falls, and the IS curve illustrates the negative relationship between interest rates and output. So what I'd like you to do is think of an axis where interest rates are on the vertical axis, investment is on the horizontal axis, and you have a negatively sloped curve. So as the interest rates go down, you get more investment. And when you get more investment, You must have more income in order to generate more savings so that you could equate investment and savings with one another. That's why the negative slope. Okay. Now here is where the equations start to kick in. And before we go through these equations, let me just tell you, all these equations are going to do with the next several slides is put in mathematical terms, what I've already covered for you, what is in that slide with all the verbiage and the red, excuse me, all that verbiage and with the red sentences that we went through, that individual slide. So let's take a look at this. And all of these symbols here can become complicated if you don't work them through. I'm begging each of you, for the standpoint of your learning, your knowledge, and your understanding, just take an hour, 1 hour. It's not asking you much for a major chapter in a textbook. Spend 1 hour going through the next several slides that I've put together for you so that you can get these relationships down pat. So, where are we with this? You see a lot of symbols here which you should be aware of. If you've done your work, you should be aware of these symbols already. And you should know, of course, that every symbol that you see in every one of these slides, if you say to yourself, what exactly is CT? All you have to do is go to the very last page of your textbook, and it's all laid out for you. All of the symbols in the entire textbook are on the last page of the book, right before the thick cover of the book, so they're all there for you. So what is this saying? You know, you look at A bar there, and it says consumption is some fraction of income. Well, we know what that fraction is. It's 2/3. But what's really important here is the last equation that you see here. And what that's saying is, look at the share of income in the economy. We know consumption is 2/3. That was 68%. That was a question on your test. Let's look at the share of GDP, which is made up by investment. And what that says is, okay, there is some parameter, AI, which really what that's really showing us is the share of income of potential GDP that is part of all investment. So what share of potential GDP is investment? That's what that AI is. Then you have minus B bar, capital RT minus R bar. So let's take a look at this. And if you understand this equation, the next several slides just fall right into place. So let's take a look at what this is. So you have A bar, and you're saying, okay, you have potential GDP, which we have defined as being sort of this steady state level of GDP, the long-term trend, which is driven by productivity growth plus growth in the labor force. That's the potential GDP. What share of that is taken up by investment? And then you look at RT minus R bar. RT, capital RT, is the real interest rate, and R bar is the marginal product of capital. So let's think about this for a minute. You have the real interest rate minus the marginal product of capital. If that's a positive number, RT minus R bar, if that's a positive number, that is going to be a drain on investment. What it's saying is that you're better off putting your money, say, in a bond and getting the real interest rate than you are getting some return, which we call the marginal product of capital, from your investment. And a point I made before, which we will go into detail in a few weeks, is that when investments are made, you're not only making a choice between, should I buy this machine or should I buy that machine? You're also asking, should I buy that machine or should I just put the money in the financial markets? B bar is a measure of how sensitive this gap is between the real interest rate and the marginal product of capital. And the more sensitive it is, the flatter that IS curve is going to be. So what we're looking at is we're saying, okay, we know that investment is going to be determined to some extent by the relationship between what the investment is going to yield for you, which is the R bar, versus what you could get as a real interest rate, say by buying bonds or putting your money into some other fixed income asset. And then how sensitive is the marketplace to that, which is the B bar. And what this is saying is, okay, if for whatever reason that real interest rate is higher than what you could expect to get from the investment's going to go down. And again, here's this whole sense that interest rates relate to the volume of investment, and that the higher the interest rates go, the less investment you're likely to get. So this is all eminently logical. And if you think it through, take your own time, take a look at these different variables, think it through, it'll hit you immediately. And you go, yeah, of course. You know, if we have some kind of sensitivity to the gap between interest rates and what the investment would yield, if the yield on the investment isn't as high as you can get on the real interest rate, and you have some sensitivity to that notion, then you're not gonna invest as much. So this is an extremely important concept. And what it really says is, you know, think about it. We're all making choices all the time. And the choices are always between alternatives that may have good outcomes for us. You know, the marginal product of capital is a good outcome for us. It tells us what we could expect to get by adding one more unit of capital. But if it's not as much as you can get by putting the money in the financial markets, then put the money in the financial markets, in which case you're going to get less capital investment. And if that B bar is a relatively high number, then there's going to be a lot of sensitivity to that. There's going to be a lot of money fleeing capital investments and going into the financial markets. Okay. So here it is again. I'm not going to deal with that. Potential output is a concept we've talked about before. Let me skip these because these are all explanatory. More of the same, just maneuvering pieces around. By the way, when you see this, you won't see all of this fuzziness and things that are overlapping. This is just a product of Blackboard. For those of you who have the PowerPoint that have seen it, you know that the overlapping stuff is not there. So, when I talk a lot about just manipulating the algebra, this is a classic case of manipulating the terminology and using the algebra to come up with something that's really important. What this is all about is simply a matter of very simple definitions. Everything here is definitions. There's nothing that's arguable about this. There's no concept. So what is this saying to us? Y equals YD plus taxes. Or what it's really saying is that your total income is that which is disposable plus that which you paid in taxes. Think about it. If the only income you got was your paycheck, you know that that paycheck is your disposable income after they took out taxes. So total income is disposable income plus taxes. And your disposable income can be divided in only two ways, that which you spend and that which you don't spend. That which you don't spend we call savings. That's the S. We know that GDP plus I plus G plus net exports, exports minus imports, another definition. Now all you're doing is substituting. Just substitute terms into one another. There's nothing new that's added, and just manipulate things and move them around and do substitutions. And what do you end up with? A real concept of what do we actually mean when we say total planned savings have to equal total investment. So planned savings could be private, and it could be public or governmental, and it could be foreign. So let's take a look at that. private savings. Well, your private savings are your income minus your taxes, minus any spending that you did. So again, think about it again. It's right up there. It's the second line on this page. You have your income, and then the taxes were taken out. Whatever is left is disposable, and then you can do two things with it. Spend it or not spend it. The part you spend is C. Anything left over is S. So that's your private spending. Or saving, I'm sorry. Government saving. Well, to the extent that the government collects more revenue than it spends, taxes are higher than government spending, you would have governmental savings. Now, right now in the United States, you don't have that at the federal level, but in many states, they are running surpluses. In many states, T is greater than G. And so there is government saving at some states. In the aggregate in the US, if you count state and local governments plus the federal, then T is less than G, and government saving is a negative number. And then there's foreign savings, imports minus exports. You know, to the extent that you import more than you export, it's a truism that savings are coming into your country. We'll talk about that at the end of the semester. So you put this all together, and these things in a planned way have to equal investment. But the beauty of a page like this is it reminds you of what do we mean by consumption and savings. Well, that's your disposable income. But what it's really saying is that you can only do two things, spend or not spend. And it reminds you of that. But when you do all of the algebra here, what you pull away from it is that we've got different sources of savings that in the aggregate have to come together. And it's a truism. It is almost by definition that they have to equal planned investment. And there's your IS curve. It is downward sloping. You've got a real interest rate on the vertical axis. You've got output or investment, doesn't matter. You got output on your horizontal axis. Why is it downward sloping? Because if you have, let's say, the highest interest rate that you see on this chart, that would curtail investment, which would mean that you would need less output or less income because you need to generate less savings, and savings are a function of income. That's where that comes from. That's the downward slope. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go backward, and let's see if we could dissect this by using the charts that my professor used for me when I was an undergraduate that I kept all of these years. So what I'd like you to do is start on the lower right where it says A. Now, my professor called it the marginal efficiency of investment. Your author, Jones, calls it the marginal product of capital. It is the same idea. Okay? And the idea here is that you would expect to get less of a return at the margin from investment when interest rates are higher, like 8%, than you would when interest rates are lower, like 6%. So it's a downward sloping curve. Every additional unit of investment yields to you less than the unit before. But that's totally consistent with what we learned from the solo growth model. Exactly the same thing. Remember, the marginal return that you get per unit of capital is positive, but it's diminishing. And as I pointed out to you, those who have some math, that's a negative second derivative in that relationship, going up, but at a decreasing rate. That's what this is showing. Then you go up to B. And what B says is, okay, we want savings to equal investment. And this is a curve that just shows savings being equal to investment. Whatever the level of savings, that's the level of investment. But how do we get savings? You go to C. Savings are a function of income. The higher the income, the more we would expect to save. Exactly the point I made about we save less than Jeff Bezos. And then you go down to D and you derive the IS curve, which shows us that for every level of income, there is an associated interest rate that would be lower. So let's follow that through. Look at income level 500. 500 income level is associated with more savings. Just look up at C. But it is also associated, as we see in D, with a lower interest rate. Look at income level 300. When income is 300, savings are going to be lower. You see that on C, and that would be associated with a higher interest rate. Why? Because if savings are lower, investment has to be lower because they have to be equated with each other. So I always found this to be an extremely useful way of looking at the derivation of an IS curve, something that literally came out of my Economics 201 notebook, which I've kept all of these decades because I thought that my professor just did such a terrific job with that. Let me stop here for a moment and ask you if you have any questions. I hope you've been studying this stuff. I've had this assignment up on Blackboard for quite a while. I hope you've been studying. But if you haven't, you really have to work through the equations, okay? And if you get stumped, you really have to ask me questions. You really have to make me earn the $5 an hour that they pay me. Okay. One of the things that we find all the time is that macroeconomic analysis has microeconomic foundations, meaning you simply can't go away from things that you learn in microeconomics and expect that you could be a macroeconomist. You just can't, because what it's simply doing is say, hey, look from the bottom up, and if you understand what's happening at the bottom up, aggregate it all together. That's what macro is. Macroeconomics is the summation of everything each individual household, business, government does, plus the interactions with one another. That's how you get macro numbers. Well, one of the things that we know from microeconomics is some sense of where something like investment is going to stop. And this is where we talked about things in the growth model. And to just repeat something we learned from our study of the growth models, as long as at the margin, the marginal product of capital or the marginal efficiency of investment, however you want to define it, as long as it's positive, it means that every single additional piece of investment that you make, in other words, every piece of capital that you add to your capital stock is adding something. And you stop when the increment that you're adding is zero, or you stop, in the case of the solo growth model, at the level where all you're doing is replacing depreciated capital, where depreciation equals investment. That's very important. It comes down to, a question I used to ask in my graduate classes all the time. And it's a sensitive subject. It's especially sensitive right now because we have a new schools chancellor in New York City. And this question is going to befuddle him like it befuddled his predecessor, Dr. Carranza. And here's the question. Let's say, hypothetically, a super wealthy person decides to give the New York City school system $50 million and says, spend the $50 million in the very best, most productive way. But there are two choices for how I want that money spent. Pick the one that's most productive. Choice A, put the money in the schools where the children are most needy educationally, maybe maybe even financially needy. Maybe these are underserved schools. or schools where the kids are or feel as though they have been marginalized in some way, and maybe help those kids. That's choice A. Choice B, New York City has the most fantastic specialized high schools. Stuyvesant High School, Bronx High School of Science, Brooklyn Tech, etc. The specialized schools. Put the money into specialized schools because in the end, the return that you will get on investment is higher. So the question is, where do you put the money? A strict microeconomist with no political agenda whatsoever will say to you the choice is clear. You put the money in the specialized high schools. And you keep putting money into the specialized high schools until you get to the point where the money isn't yielding anything favorable anymore. And then you take whatever is left over and then you put it into the schools with the kids who have the biggest needs. Now, you might say politically, socially, culturally, that's the wrong move. But if you're a microeconomist, it definitely makes the most sense. In the end, it's more likely that some kid coming out of the specialized school, and I'm saying likely, I'm not saying it's necessarily true, I'm saying it is likely that a kid coming out of one of those specialized schools is likely to get into and excel in one of the special universities, a Harvard, an MIT, a University of Chicago, a Stanford, Berkeley, University of Virginia, Queens College. It's more likely that one of those kids is going to more likely get into those schools and excel there, in which case the benefits to society are the greatest. Well, this is what we look at a lot when we talk about making moves to make investment equal to saving. Where do you put your investment money? And you're going to put your investment money into physical capital only to the extent that the return that you get on that physical capital is greater than the return you would get by putting it into the financial markets. And that's why we paid so much attention a few minutes ago at that relationship between the real interest rate and the marginal product of capital. Now, what generates an IS curve, as you saw, is some notion that saving and investment must be equal to each other. And saving, of course, is functionally related to income, as is consumption. So if we think of saving as being the increment that's left over after you have your income, minus your taxes, minus your consumption, whatever is left over is savings, which we showed before, then it's kind of incumbent upon us to pay some attention to consumption. And what we're going to be doing for the next few minutes or so is exactly that. We're going to be paying attention to consumption. Now, in a few weeks, we're going to do an entire unit on consumption, just consumption. And we will go over exactly the same stuff I'm about to do now, but we have to do it in this context as well as later because, first of all, reinforcement is a good thing. And secondly, what we're going to do now helps to reinforce the micro foundations of an IS curve. So let's take a look at some of the theories of consumption, a couple of which we've touched upon before, but let's go deeper. Permanent income hypothesis. We've talked about permanent income before. We said that Milton Friedman, again, there he is again, the guy who said inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Friedman talked about the permanent income hypothesis, and he's the guy who said we have a sense of our income going out 3 years. You remember we talked about that? Our clearest sense of our future income is what we'll earn by the end of this year. We can sort of come up with a good guess for where we will be next year. 2 years out, it becomes a little shady as to how good our forecast will be. And that's about as far as we can see. And we consider that our permanent income, and our behavior in the marketplace is predicated upon that. And what we build into that is also a sense of how much wealth we have, because we know that wealth is a critical factor in determining what we buy, when we buy, how much we buy, the quality of what we buy. So you can have a relatively small income, but if you've accumulated quite a bit of wealth, you will behave in a marketplace like a wealthy person, even though your income may be relatively small. And part of your wealth, Friedman argued, is your human capital. Can't take that away from you. If you know that you have a really good skill set, if you know you're really good, let's say, stock picking, well, that says, I think I'm always going to have money in my pocket because I'm a great stock picker. That's part of my permanent wealth. And so Friedman's point was when people get a sense of their permanent income, which is their human capital, their financial and other kinds of wealth, as well as a picture of what their income is likely to be over the next 3-year period, that really determines how people behave in the marketplace. That people who are feeling really, really comfortable are more likely to buy a more expensive car and to do so more frequently. They've got the car 3 years, they're tired of seeing it, they get another car. Where somebody else might look at it and go, in order for that car to make sense, I bought the car and I got to have it at least 15 years to amortize the marginal product that I'm going to get out of that automobile. You behave differently. Some people shop in discount stores. Other people shop in Tiffany's, and they buy expensive jewelry. Okay? Based upon their sense of their permanent income. Then there's the relative income hypothesis. And relative here does not mean your cousins, your aunts and uncles. Nope. We're not talking about relative in that sense. We're talking about relative in the sense of relative versus absolute. Relative meaning you're making a comparison. And there are a couple of aspects to this that we will pay attention to very quickly. So you get a sense of what James Tobin, another Nobel Prize winner from Yale University, had in mind here. Tobin and another economist named Duesenberry all played with this hypothesis. It starts out by saying that consumption tends to be emulative. Well, you know what it's like to emulate somebody is to look at them with loving eyes, or you look at them and you go, see, that's what I want to be. I want to be like Mike. That's what that commercial was. Be like Mike, meaning Michael Jordan. But none of us could really be like Mike, could we? I mean, none of us could play basketball like Michael Jordan did. Nobody could earn the kind of money that Michael Jordan did. We don't have the fame of Michael Jordan. We don't have any of that. But the concept of that commercial, be like Mike, was to be emulative. So who can you emulate? And according to the relative income hypothesis, the folks we tend to emulate are people who are like us, but maybe a little bit sharper, cooler, more with it, maybe a little more affluent. And so you have your nice little house in the suburbs, and you have, your nice little flower garden, and in your backyard you have this nice little barbecue, and you invite the in-laws over for hot dogs and hamburgers, and that's very, very nice. But your next door neighbor has a house very similar to yours, and your next door neighbor just put in a little pool in the ground. What emulative behavior says is that if you really admire that next door neighbor and you look at that next door neighbor and you go, maybe I ought to put in a pool. But what this really says is we all emulate all the time. I mean, every one of us wears sorts of uniforms. The clothing you wear is clothing that tends to be consistent with your age group, your status economically and financially, maybe even where you live. There could be many factors that are involved in it. The clothing you wear may have to do with occupations. It could be whether or not you're in a classroom or not. But when you look out there and you say, I want to wear the right kind of clothing. And I remember when my son started college, he left Queens, where we had our house at that point. And then we went up, like he just started college. So we went up, I think it was October. and it was really cold. I mean, it was freezing up there. And we said, "Where's your coat?" He said, "I don't have a coat." I said, "Of course you have a coat. You took your coat up with you." And he said, "I can't wear that thing." I said, "What's the matter with it?" He said, "Oh, it's all raggy and all that." And I said, "So you couldn't go to a store up where your college is and buy a coat?" He said, "I just didn't see one that I like, so I didn't buy one. So I'm just wearing sweatshirts. I'm fine just wearing sweatshirts." Bam. That's emulative behavior, because all the people that he saw up in upstate New York in this cold weather were wearing types of clothing, and he looked at that and he goes, "That's what I would wear. I'm not wearing that stuff I had at Cardozo High School in Queens. I'm not wearing that stuff. I'm wearing the stuff everybody up in college is wearing." He was emulative. There's your perfect example. But there's one more aspect of this that is critical to the relative income hypothesis, and that is the notion that we are emulative of ourselves. And here's what I mean by that. Suppose things were going really well for you, and you were living a certain lifestyle, and you were comfortable with that lifestyle, and then all of a sudden things weren't going so well. Maybe your hours were cut back. Maybe you lost your job entirely. Maybe whatever sources of income you have just either slowed down or stopped, were terminated. Well, the first things that people do is say, well, things will get better, and they continue to live their life as though nothing happened. But you can't do that very long. And then the next thing you do is you start to make choices at the margin. Well, do I really need to go out and buy something for breakfast every day? Maybe I could just make a slice of toast, in my apartment. I don't really need to buy breakfast outside. And you start to cut back, and you cut back, and you cut back. And then fortunately, the worm turns and things start getting better for you, and you start to go back to the kind of lifestyle. Well, I'm sorry, you can start to afford the kind of lifestyle that you had before. And what we know is that people will go back, and their consumption function, their relationship between consumption and income, will snap back to where it was before they lost their job, before they had that hit to their income. It will ratchet back. Now, think of ratchet not in the colloquial sense, because I know that a lot of people use that word in a non-complimentary way, but think of a tool, a ratchet, which allows you to turn a screw in one direction. That's what a ratchet does. So you will ratchet right back to where you were before, because you will emulate what you consider to be the lifestyle that you were best at. And there's proof that people do this. They do it sometimes based on what I just said, but they do it in other ways. How many people say they're on a diet because they want their body to look like the way they looked when they were 18, and they're now 48 or 58 or 68 years old, and they think that if they diet, their body's going to go back to what they looked like when they were 18 or 19. Trust me, it doesn't work. But they try that. Or how many times have we seen older people dressing in a way where you go, the clothing is nice, but not for a guy of his age or a woman of her age. I mean, what is she doing wearing that stuff? She's not 19 years old. Like, why is she wearing that? We do that all the time. And we see all of these cosmetics to take out wrinkles from people's faces, or with Botox or whatever it is, because people are trying to emulate the way they felt they were at their best, and to keep that kind of look or lifestyle or whatever. And that's the essence of the relative income hypothesis, this tendency to be emulative, but even to be emulative of yourself. Then there's the life cycle hypothesis, which effectively is really easy. It just says divide people's lives into three parts: the part before they save, the part when they save, and the part, excuse me, where they draw down their saving. When you're young, you probably don't have much of an income, if any at all. You tend to save. And then you have a working life, and during your working life, you save. And effectively, what the life cycle hypothesis says is you save an amount, if you can, that says, okay, when I retire, I want to have enough money so that on the day I die, I'll basically spend my last dollar. That's sort of the phenomenon we look at. And so financial planners will say you need to save a certain amount of money with the anticipation that you will draw down on your savings at a rate of 4 to 6% every year. So let's say 5. Well, 5% every year would mean that you have to have enough money for 20 years. That's effectively what that's saying. And that's how much you need to save. So how much money do you anticipate you're going to be spending during your retirement years? That's how much you have to save. And savings means not just what is left over from consumption, but that which you have earned, let's say, from investments. That whole portfolio has to be enough to last you through your retirement years, such that on the day you die, you're probably going to spend the last dollar that you have. That would be perfect. That's the life cycle hypothesis. So let me stop here and ask you if you have any questions about that. I think these are kind of fun. And again, why are we studying consumption? Because consumption is attached at the hip to savings. You have disposable income. Whatever you don't consume is saved. And you need savings in order to equate with investment. Okay, I'm going to introduce this concept only, and then we'll pick this up on Wednesday. This is really critical right now. There is all kinds of debate going on in the economics community about the $1.9 trillion expenditure package that Congress just passed that goes on top of the others, such that we now have $3 trillion in fiscal stimulus between the two packages passed when Trump was president and the one package passed under Biden. Multiplier effects. And the question in multiplier effects basically comes down to the following. All right, so you put an additional dollar into the economy. How many dollars of national income does that dollar that you put into the economy actually generate? And that's not a moot question, because we know that what happens is money changes hands. Remember, MV equals PY. We know that's velocity. We know that there's a certain amount of bang for the buck that you put into the economy. How strong is that? How much are we going to get out of it? Simplistically, we say a lot of that is going to depend upon two things. You put money in the economy, and there are two things we have to look at. What is the propensity for people to actually spend that money? Propensity is a fancy word that just means tendency. So what is the tendency for people to spend that money? What is their marginal propensity to consume? You've given them $1, and of that $1 you gave them, how much of it are they actually going to spend? Now, another way to look at that is to say, how much of it are they actually not going to spend? How much of it are they going to save? That's the same question, isn't it? But look how the perspective changes. We are talking about IS curves, so we have to be thinking about how much is going to be saved. There's one more element to this. We don't spend our income plus save our income. We only spend and save that portion of the income left over after taxes. So then the second question is, how much of the money that people get is going to end up being taxed? Well, you might say the stimulus checks don't get taxed, which they won't. But when you spend that money, someone is going to earn it. And then that person is going to have to pay taxes on it. So you may not pay taxes on it, but when you spend it, either the store where you spend it, or the business in general where you spend it, or the university where you spend it, or the person that you buy something from is going to have to pay taxes on it. So we look very carefully at what the marginal propensity to consume is and what the marginal tax rates are to get a sense of how much bang we're going to get from that buck. The concept we're talking about here is a multiplier. And what it's really saying is that if I spend $1, you will earn $1. Remember, MV equals PY. MV is the spending side. PY is the earning side. So if I spend $1, you earn $1, or some business earns $1. And then the question is, of that dollar that they earned, how much of it gets taxed away? And then how much of what is left over after that do they end up spending? And now, if they've done any spending at all, someone has to be earning that. Same question for the next person who earns that. Of the money that you just earned, how much of it is going to get taxed away? And how much of it are you going to spend? Well, some of it is going to get spent, presumably, which means somebody else is going to earn. And I think you get the process here. It keeps going on and on. So the bottom line is, if the government puts $1 into the system and some portion of that dollar after taxes gets spent, overall, over the course of time, GDP is going to go up by more than $1, at least theoretically. And so we look very carefully at this from a macro perspective, and this is what economists around the world are actually looking at to see how much are we going to get for this. Nobody that I know of anticipated that with the first 2 stimulus packages that took place last year, that the saving rate or the non-consumption part of it would be as high as it turned out to be. People saved a lot more than we anticipated. We thought that the stimulus impact was going to be greater, meaning the propensity to consume would be greater than it turned out to be. People saved a lot of that money. And as I pointed out to you, we ended up with a savings rate which normally hangs around 5%, and it shot up in the 20% area. We don't ever see savings rates in the US like that. That's more like Japan in the 1980s. I mean, we don't see those kinds of savings rates. And so as these checks are going out now, questions are being asked of the $1,400 that people are going to get, of the $300 a month they get for their children, of the unemployment benefits that people are getting that have been enhanced by $300 a week. How much of that is actually going to get spent? Why is it important? Because when they spend, somebody else earns. And when that person earns, or that business earns, they turn around and they spend a part of it. And it goes around and around and around. So ultimately, the total number of incomes generated is going to be more than the $1,400 that the individual got. So I'm going to stop here because going into multiplier effects takes some time. And this is a good, convenient point to stop. But before we do, let me ask you again if you have any questions. Okay, before you go, please stay with me. Please don't leave. There are some people in the class to whom I need to ask a personal favor. Okay? This is a favor, so there's nothing wrong. There's no problem with this. I'm going to ask a favor of you. Some of you in the class know some of my students in my CCNY class. If you do know somebody in my CCNY class, would you send me an email to the email address I've given you, smallinphd@outlook.com, and say, yes, I have a friend in your CCNY class, and here's that person's name. Okay? You would be doing me a personal favor. There is absolutely no problem. There's no issue with that. There's nothing for you to be concerned about. But you'd be doing a personal favor for me because I have to do some research into that phenomenon for something that my chairman wants, and I just need to know that. So if you know somebody in my CCNY class, please send me an email and say, yes, I know someone in your CCNY class. That person's name is whatever that name is. And I would be very, very grateful. You'll save me hours of research. Okay? Okay, thanks a lot, folks. And we will reconvene on Wednesday. We'll go over the homework. We'll finish this topic, and we'll move on. It was great being with you. Take good care.